In this section, we'll be looking at Sparta, Athens, and the military. So, first of all, just to kind of situate ourselves geographically, so Greece is here, Athens is here, and Sparta is roundabout here. And we're going to start by looking at Sparta. And when you think of Sparta, if you've seen the movie 300, you probably think of the king Leonidas, who spends much of the movie screaming very loudly and killing people. And there's a reason for this. Sparta was very much a military society. Now, the early history of Sparta is unclear. There are not a lot of written sources about Sparta. I believe most, if not all of them, are by non-Spartans. And so, there are people who aren't from there who are describing them, so they may not quite get the Spartans or why the Spartans do what they do. Though at times they do try and be at least fair. And it seems that the Spartans were not really supposed to write down much about themselves because that might fall into like enemy hands, and then the enemies of Sparta could learn about them and use that knowledge to their advantage. So the Spartans were always concerned with national security. In addition, Sparta was not really all that well developed in terms of infrastructure. They didn't have like really beautiful stone temples or works of art or anything much like that. So because of that, there's not a whole lot of archaeological evidence about them. But one thing we do know about them, and this is kind of key, is they are going to subjugate their neighbors, right? They conquer the people around them and make them into what are called helots. And helots are slaves. So the Spartans will enslave the people around them. And I want to stress what this does to Sparta is it makes Sparta into a slave society. Now, there are societies with slaves. For example, China had slaves. But there weren't that many. It was just a part of society. But in Sparta, and it's difficult always to know numbers when we talk about the ancient world, but there was something like 7 helots for every 1 Spartan, right? So for every 1 free Spartan, there were 7 enslaved helots. That's not a society with slaves, that's a slave society in which all of society is geared around a system of slavery. And that's key to why Sparta became such a warrior society, because they were focused on preventing the helots from launching a successful rebellion. Right? They developed into a warrior society built around preventing the helots from launching a successful rebellion. This is what always, I shouldn't say always, but typically in a slave society, there's always a fear among free people that slaves will rebel. And so what happens is the free people then focus on becoming warriors to prevent any kind of slave rebellion. So the Spartans didn't become warriors to go out and conquer a bunch more territory. They were not really interested in doing that after the initial subjugation of the helots. Their primary interest in their military was preventing a slave rebellion. And so you had this society where the Spartans themselves really didn't do much other than learn how to fight. All the productive work was actually done by the helots. So it's a very kind of society very different from what we might be familiar with. The Spartans also developed a very curious kind of government. It was definitely a mixed system that had not 1 but 2 kings. And it's kind of curious, in the movie 300, the focus is on only 1 king, King Leonidas, but there were actually 2 kings. And in addition, they also had elected officials. And you may say, well, that's kind of an odd government. How does anything get done? And the reason it was set up like this, it was not set up to have anyone take any decisive action. Rather, it was a system that had a series of checks and balances to prevent anyone from having too much power. Because what happens is if one person gets too much power, or one group gets too much power, then there's going to be a conflict between those who have power and those who want it. And that will lead to division and slave rebellion. So this is a system, again, we have a slave society. This is a system that's designed to prevent slave rebellion and to keep the slaves slaves. So the idea is you have checks and balances to prevent anyone from having too much power, any of the free Spartans, so that way they're always on the same team. We don't want Spartan against Spartan. We don't want conflict between Spartans. So we need to make sure that power is shared enough. The focus should be on Sparta as a group, as the whole. You should be thinking about Sparta first and foremost. And to ensure that you think of Sparta first and foremost, we need to make sure that you feel that your voice is respected and that power is shared. And so what this creates is a very conservative and insular society, right? The Spartans do not want to go out and conquer after they initially conquer the Helots, because if their army leaves to go out and conquer, there's a fear of a slave rebellion. And they have the slaves under control. They don't want any changes because that could lead to weakness, that could lead to division. And of course, they don't really want to have much contact with anyone else because people coming into Sparta might bring in new ideas. So they want an insular society. They want a stable society in order to keep the slaves under control. So like I said, this is what happens when you have a slave society. Now, with Sparta out of the way, we're going to talk about Athens. But before we do so, we need to emphasize something about this class so far. The story so far, we have had governments based on monarchs, like kings, emperors, etc., who obtain legitimacy from the divine, right? The emperor of China rules because he has the mandate of heaven. The Japanese emperor rules because he's descended from Amaterasu. Hammurabi rules because he has a special relationship with Marduk. And the job of these monarchs, based on their divine legitimacy, was to maintain order, resolve conflict, and provide justice. But the Greeks, particularly the Athenians, are going to introduce something new, right? They're going to bring something new, and that is democracy. They're going to do the same kind of thing, maintain order, resolve conflict, and provide justice, but not so much by talking about the gods, but by talking about power coming basically from the people, or at least some people. We'll talk more about that shortly. But I just want to emphasize, the Athenians in particular, but other Greek city-states as well, are going to be doing something very revolutionary. And I think this is only possible because they have such small city-states. But we'll come back to that in a second. So to talk about Athens and democracy, Athens had a lot of problems. There was a lot of conflict in Athens, a lot of economic conflict in particular. There was a rising class of wealthier farmers. There were rising merchant class. And then there was the old wealthy people. And when you've got one group that has power because they have wealth, and then you have a new rising wealthy group, that can lead to conflict. Of course, there would obviously be conflict between the rich and the poor. There was also family conflicts. Different families competed for power and prestige. And there were ideological conflicts. You know, what's the best way to deal with this? Right? Should we have a monarchy, rule by one? Should we have an oligarchy in which we have a rule by few? What kind of government do we need to resolve these conflicts? And these attempts at resolving the conflicts, monarchy and oligarchy, fail to maintain the peace. There's a lot of conflict in Athens. And one thing we want to stress, when your government is divided, that's when you're in danger, right? When the people are divided and fighting, that's a perfect time for someone to invade. Sparta actually invaded Athens a couple of times. In fairness to the Spartans, it's because someone from Athens in one of these conflicts invited them in. But the key thing is, you know, if you're divided, that's bad for your government, and Athens is really divided, and they need to come up with a system of government that will help overcome that. And a man, Cleisthenes, is going to rise to power. We're not sure exactly when he died. He was born probably about 570 BC. He rises to power fairly old, and he's going to introduce a series of reforms, which we can call isonomic, which there's different ways you can translate this, but this basically means equality before the law. Now, I don't want you to think that all people were equal before the law, but the idea here is that there was increased equality for male citizens. Don't think about equality as like an absolute thing. It's a relative thing. Relatively more people are becoming equal. The group of people who are considered equal, there's more of them now. And he will introduce reforms like that to bring more equality before the law. He will change voting districts to make voting more equitable. Again, it's really kind of tricky to explain without going into a lot of detail, but basically in a lot of early democracies and republics, the way voting worked, different people's votes were valued differently. So if you were a wealthier person, a more powerful person, higher status person, you got more, you had, your vote was worth more than other people. And they also had problems with like gerrymandering. You may have heard of that, where you redraw the districts in order to strengthen one particular political party. He changed the way people voted to make it more equitable. One thing that I think is really fascinating is he also introduced a lottery system for most positions. So you know how like you can get called for jury duty? It's basically like a lottery, like they just randomly pick your name and then you may have to go sit in a jury. That's how, under Cleisthenes' reforms, that's how Athens started to fill a lot of its government posts, was just by lottery. So can you imagine if you went to your mail and you got a letter from the government and the government said, hey, guess what? You're now sheriff. Or you're now a judge, or something like that. Or you're now in the legislature. That's how it worked. And that may seem kind of odd to us because we are, typically of the opinion that you need to be like a specialized person. You need to be like a politician who spends all your time fulfilling that job. To the Athenians and to a lot of the Greeks, well, no, that was just what citizens do, right? You don't need any special legal training to sit on a jury. Well, maybe you don't need any specific training to do these other things. If you're a citizen, you should be able to do it. It's kind of the idea. And I mean, this isn't necessarily a terrible idea in many ways, right? Among many people, there is a certain common sense that I think would make them well suited for the government. And one thing that was interesting was when you became a government official in what was called the boule, which was basically like a huge face-to-face democratic organ, you were expected to take an oath in which you promised to advise according to the laws what was best for the people. So I just want to stress, I mean, oaths in ancient Greece were religious, but the legitimacy of the government comes from law and people, right? The legitimacy is fundamentally from the people, and there's fundamentally this idea that we need to govern people according to laws. Who makes the laws? The people make the laws. Now, I want to stress when I say the people, I'm talking about free men of a certain age. But that's a big deal for this time period. And one thing I want to stress, again, to us, this seems very restrictive, these ideas of democracy. To people in the ancient world, this seemed nuts. They were like, there's no way you can do this. This is totally going to fail. Right? They said you need to have more aristocracy, more kingship. You cannot let the common people, even what to us is a limited amount of common people, you can't let them govern. They don't know what they're doing. Now, one thing that I also want to point out that it may have been developed by Cleisthenes, it's not clear, but there also developed the idea of what's called ostracism. Now, when you were a kid in school, there may have been a child who was excluded, right? People didn't like that child. And your teacher may say, hey, don't ostracize him. Ostracize is like to exclude. And basically what could happen is if people were nervous that there was a person who was getting too powerful and who might try and become like a dictator in Athens, you could call for an ostracism. And people could get together, thousands of people would get together because they would, as part of the voting structure, you would call, the basic assembly together, and they could vote on whether or not to ostracize someone. And if you were ostracized, you had to leave the city for 10 years and travel a certain distance away. While you were gone, your property was still protected, and, no one was supposed to do anything to your family or anything like that. You just had to leave. Now, you didn't have to commit a crime. It was simply because people thought you were too powerful. That's the reason why they could get rid of you, right? This person is too powerful. They threaten the democracy. They may try and become a tyrant. So we're going to vote to ostracize them. But in any case, you can see here a very different system of government from what we've been talking about.